Is global warming real? Is climate change irreversible? Why are carbon emissions still rising? Join host Dr. Alberto Troccoli, a global leader in climate science and its application to the energy sector, as he unpacks these pressing issues. Through candid conversations with leading experts, get ready to demystify climate change and explore its many layers. So, let's Climunicate!
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Let's Climunicate. It's a great pleasure to have with us today author and social scientist Rebecca Huntley, based in Sydney. I'm talking from Brisbane, and I look forward to talking with you, Rebecca.
Really happy to be with you.
Excellent. So I've looked a bit of your history and was fascinated by something you've done about 5 years ago. You had a kind of awakening and you moved from somebody that was aware of climate to an activist. Can you just talk a bit about your background and how you got there, just as a way to know you a little bit more, please?
Yeah. So I've been this is my 20th year as a social researcher, and, over those, the 15 or so years before I started being very interested in climate, I had researched community attitudes to climate change before and environmental issues. I wasn't, uninterested in those issues, but I wasn't particularly focused on them. And then I was really inspired by the young men and women, particularly young women, who led the school strike for climate. And I think what was impactful and moving about that was a lot of those young men and women were just a little bit older than my children. And so I had a real sense of, going from being, the younger generation where you don't feel that there's a lot that you can do, to being kind of that older generation thinking I have an obligation to my children's generation and those that go forward to make sure that we're all doing our bit to create a livable world for them. And I really found that their concern was genuine, and their concern, and it kind of really snapped me from being, worried about it or concerned about it, but probably would be my fourth or fifth issue, to being one of the top issues very quickly. I was probably already a bit on the path because I love being a bushwalker, love the Australian bush. So I think probably would have happened eventually, but that was the catalyst, really.
Excellent. I think this also can provide some inspiration from other people, because sometimes I find that we feel strongly about something, and then somehow, without us knowing, there's a trigger, and then that triggers take you to a different place. But until it happens, you don't know that it happens. But yeah, going through some of the experience you had, maybe, that can guide some other people to follow a similar path. I don't know whether you have some suggestions or some kind of clues for what to look for.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we've actually tried to do some, in the work that I do as a social researcher, trying to understand how people feel about climate and how do we protect nature, and how do we encourage support in renewable energy. Those triggers from being kind of concerned, but it's not a big deal, to not a huge priority, to being really concerned can often be very personal. So it can be everything from, I've met older Australians who've said when their grandchildren are born, there's this kind of sense of, what kind of world will they be inheriting? For other people, it's being in an extreme weather event, particularly like a fire. The Black Summer fires, not for everybody, but for some of the people who are involved, it really, whether they lost places that they loved or places they liked to go on holidays, or they actually lost, their own homes. That was often a big catalyst. I work very closely. I do some work with bushfire survivors for climate. So I think it is can be quite personal what makes you go from tip you over, I suppose we would say, from being concerned to really alarmed about climate.
Right. So let's step back a little. So this was a very nice introduction of where you come from and
Yep.
your experiences. We now want to dive into more substantial topics about social science, how that relates to climate, and what can we do basically in the end about climate science, what actions we can make. We get to that also during our discussion. But before we actually move to that, we have some standard questions, quick-fire questions we ask to all our guests.
Well, it's a test.
It's
Am I being
a kind of
tested?
test. Exactly. But you can also opt for not answering. It's not
Okay. Can I take the fifth or pass?
it's not compulsory, and there's no
Okay.
grading actually. So
Okay,
so
good. All right.
so
good.
you're safe.
Good.
So the first question is, by how much, with what you know, by how much has the air temperature of the globe changed in the last 150 years, roughly? Just give us
Oh, wow. I don't know. Too much. 1.9 degrees, 2.5 degrees, something like that.
Yeah, close enough. I mean, I guess we are talking about an increase, yeah? So it's
Yes, increase, yeah.
increase, yeah. So yeah, formally we are close to 1.5 degree, but
1.5
that's
degrees.
close enough. That's good.
Yes.
So
I mean,
pass on that.
whenever that happens, I always think it's so small. But when you think about just a teeny tiny increase, the impact, that we know is happening from that, that's one of the difficult thing to say, oh, it's, 1.5 degrees. And people think, oh, that's nothing. But if you kind of think about what that means for ecosystems, that's why
Exactly.
we've got to control.
And the other thing to bear in mind is that this is a global average. So there are major changes, major variations from place to place and season to season. So that's the other factor. The second question is, of this temperature increase, how much do you think human-induced greenhouse gases has contributed to it?
Oh, it's something that's like high 85%, 90%, almost all of it. There's a tiny, minuscule bit of natural change, but it's pretty much us.
Right. Okay. So yeah. So there's no, in this case, there's no straight answer, I should say. But the consensus, according to the IPCC, is that it's 100%.
100%. Right.
Some people say it could be more. Some people say less. So yeah, it's an interesting one. So the next one then is to look at the future. So given this, how much do you think the temperature is going to change over the next 80 years? Normally we look at 2100 as a target.
On the current trajectory.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, 2.2 to 2.5%, I suppose,
Degree,
beyond what we would like it to be. Yeah.
You mean degree 2.5 degrees?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Okay. That's good. And last one, a little trickier. So again, given the situation, the expectation that this temperature increases, do you have any ideas of what the risks are of us reaching as a community, as a global community, reaching a tipping point, which could be the methane thawing and
or
Siberia,
the permafrost and
permafrost, exactly, or the melting of.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I suppose having read some of this work, there are some people who believe that human society will collapse before our climate completely collapses, because there'll be so much pressure on societies because of things like drought, food shortages, issues with water, issues with extreme weather, one after another, catastrophes. How robust and resilient a lot of our democracies are going to be in the face of all these challenges is a really big question. But I think, largely what's going to happen is we're going to have parts of the world that people can't sustainably live, and those people will need to leave. They're already leaving. We've already got climate change refugees moving from different parts of the world Even if you don't count people who are leaving because of things like drought and then conflict caused by pressure on resources. So, there's going to be every country will be affected, some more than others. But the real challenges will be parts of countries that won't be able to be inhabitable because of the weather, because of the temperatures, and then people leaving. So, as well as, other things which are climate associated, but not just to do with climate, things like mass extinctions and so forth. It's not pretty.
It's not
a pretty picture. As well as things like sea level rises and various other kinds of things, It's no one can escape this, but some countries and some people within countries are more affected than others.
So there's different viewpoints on this one, but it's good to have your perspective. And that is, like I said, these questions are really just to see where you stand on these issues, which are the basic issues around the discussion on the climate change science. Obviously, there's all the other aspects of climate change, but the science, the four tenets, I think, of climate sciences are really around these questions. And we want to engage in these questions and implications in this podcast because we realize there is a lot of polarization. That's why I started this endeavor, actually, because I was living in this kind of knowledge bubble and thinking that all climate scientists, agree and everybody agrees because we are in this bubble. But then starting to talk with many people around, I found that it's not really the case. So my question, the initial question to you is, how we square this question of scientific consensus and public perception. So from a scientific consensus, let me just briefly explain where I'm coming from, because scientific consensus, we know there are some studies that have shown that a very large majority of scientists agree with the fact that, climate change is happening. There's increasing temperature. This is due to human caused emissions and like what we discussed. Having said that, though, if we look more deeply, there's also some caveats to the studies, but we won't go there now. But the main question is, how does this consensus in the science translate into, or doesn't translate into the public perception? Because we see with these movements in the US, we saw the election. There are countries in Europe as well, Hungary and partly Italy and all these situations where the sentiment of, debating the climate change issue is coming back again when we thought that the issue was sorted. So how do you square these two worlds?
Well, I suppose I don't know how to start. I suppose the first thing is that while the field of climate science and particularly the kind of work that you're talking about has been done consistently over the last kind of 30 or 40 years, it hasn't necessarily always permeated the curriculum in primary and high school, although it has more recently. So actually, we do know that younger Australians are far more likely to believe the climate science than older Australians. So I think to some extent, this has got a bit to do with education. And of course, if you don't go on to study science at TAFE or necessarily study science at university, or you've not got a personal interest in this, then you might have a vague sense. I mean, what our research shows is that, only about half of the population really believe the climate science. So when we say like, is climate change happening? Yes. Do you think it's being driven by human activity or natural cycles? The community is quite divided. I think we have to understand that it's quite difficult to kind of just give the population a science lesson about this. It's kind of tricky. I mean, it's important. We need to keep doing it, but it kind of, to teach everybody and get everybody to believe the science is challenging. We also have to know that there has been a concerted, well-funded public campaign by the fossil fuel companies to undermine the climate science and to inject doubt and say, oh, well, it could be happening, or maybe it isn't, or maybe it's not as bad. And of course, people are much more likely to hear that and absorb that in their consumption of media and everything than they are going to be consuming, scientific reports. So it's challenging. We find in the work that we do about how to effectively communicate climate science and climate action is, look, this is happening and you have to keep talking to people about it. But, it isn't easy. What we're trying to say to people is say, well, look, these are the things you can do that are going to be effective in your life, that are going to help. So really focusing on the solutions rather than trying to lecture people about the science, which they may not have the scientific knowledge or interest, and that's kind of the difficult thing. What we do need, and I'm very passionate about this, is we absolutely need leaders in the community and leaders in politics, leaders in all walks of life to accept the science. That is their responsibility. It's one thing to lecture people who's busy in their lives about climate science. It's really unconscionable that you would have people in the parliament whose role it is to listen to the CSIRO and to the Bureau of Meteorology to question the science. That's the real problem. And they should really be taking the science seriously, taking their job seriously, and taking the solution seriously.
That's obviously something that the scientific community is doing, but actually within the science, there is also, noise, because as in all constructions, when you build something, it's very easy to then bring it down. Like, for example, you mentioned the fossil fuel industry. After all these years of science, and actually the science, you may know that the science around climate change with the modeling started within the fossil fuel industry with Exxon, in the 60s, even, more than 50 years ago. But then they come back and, with one simple word, uncertainty, they managed to destroy the whole, framework of the science that has been put together. So it's very hard to debate around that. And there are now more and more people also debating the science. So, some people say the science is settled, so in terms of IPCC, this bodies, that's true. But then, there's always people that sow this doubt in the mind of people. And then you get to the politicians, like you said. So do you think it's just a small minority that creates this noise, or is it more widespread, and there needs to be more concerted effort to communicate the science?
Yeah, so if we look at what the data tells us about who is, we would call dismissive of the climate science, and also dismissive of what we would say the solutions to climate change, they still remain a relatively small percentage of the population. So only between kind of 9 to 10% of the population, of the adult population of Australia, are what we describe as dismissive. So they kind of think, oh, climate change isn't happening, and even if it is, it's not that much of a problem. And, we shouldn't move away from coal and gas. We should be moving, we should keep with coal and gas and forget about renewables that can't do the job. It's only about 10%. However, and that's compared to, for example, 26% of the community who are alarmed about climate change absolutely believe the science, believe that it's impacting their world now, and believe there needs to be urgent action. However, in the middle of all of that, there are various segments of the community who may think that climate change is happening, but they kind of wonder whether it's a bit us and a bit of a natural cycle. Some of those people might not think that the things that they're seeing around, like extreme weather or like high temperatures, are being caused by climate change. They might think, oh, we've always had hot summers and we've always had tornadoes and so forth. And so you've got these levels of doubt between the people who are absolute deniers and people who are absolute believers. And that's where the challenge lies. And we know from the work that we do about what convinces those people to act is that it isn't always trying to lecture them about the science. The science is important. It's often trying to say to them things like, you're right, the science is settled, we know it's happening. The good thing about that, because we know we're causing it, we can be, by our actions and by doing different things, we can reduce the things that are causing it. So in a sense, we've got to give people a sense of agency. What we know is that you don't have to believe the science to engage in the actions that are required to address climate change. So, for example, you might think, it might be a bit of a natural cycle, it might be us, but I'm kind of really interested in an electric vehicle because they're quiet and, it'd be great to be able to run my my car on the solar panels or whatever. So there are other ways that we can kind of convince people to do things, rather than just convincing them on the science. But to your point, we've still got to try. And again, we've got to empower our leaders to communicate about the science more effectively. But we're up against, very well-funded people who are trying to inject doubt into the science. And so we've got to counter that in some way.
And you touched on some of the work you've done in the categorization, the segmentation of the population. You touched on it. You mentioned dismissive, and you actually came up with a framework of 6 categories.
It's called the Climate Compass. It's
the Climate Compass.
7 groups, seven categories. Yeah, 7 audience segments we call.
Because I knew about alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive. So
and there's another little group called alert, which are kind of a little bit like the alarmed as well, but
right. And so that's an interesting subdivision, of course, because I guess when you talked about dismissive, it's like the core group. There's always going to be a small percentage of people who are not up for debate. Unfortunately, we know there are still people also debating about whether the Earth is flat. But we can't do much about that. But
no, we can't.
But how do you actually recognize the other categories? So how do you distinguish between an alarmed and a concerned? And actually, you called yourself a climate activist. So where does it fit activism in this spectrum?
That's a very good point. Okay. So most segmentations of this kind, attitudinal segmentations, tend to boil down to how people respond to a cluster of questions. And whether you agree or strongly agree or strongly disagree or are uncertain. I mean, one of the challenges is that if people are kind of ambivalent or uncertain or disengaged, they're often harder to talk to about climate change than people who are on the dismissive end of the scale, because they want to talk about it. So often people who are distanced from the issue, far harder to talk to than people who are dismissive, because at least you can actually have an argument with them. So there's a couple of key questions that determines where you sit in these audience segments in the Climate Compass. One of them is how strongly you agree or disagree or are ambivalent or about the question, climate change matters to me personally. So I think one of the things that all of the social science shows is that for a lot of people, climate change is an abstract scientific concept. So to the point that you were making at the beginning, where you say, how much has the world warmed over the last, 100 years or whatever? If I say 1.5%, for a lot of people, that kind of feels like nothing, and they can't see it, right? It's because of these gases that we can't really see. In a sense, when I think about something like the ozone layer, even people couldn't see it. They could imagine a hole in it, what I mean? But this notion of climate change feels so enormous, so abstract, and in some ways so kind of remote from people's daily life. So the extent to which you can kind of bridge that sense of that climate change impacts me personally is a really important one. There are other key questions about, is it too late to do anything about it? So where you feel about that, like your efficacy in terms of whether you think something can be done, whether you think it will only affect future generations rather than are the impacts being felt now. So there are a range of different questions that determine that. And it's really all about whether you feel that really focused around things like urgency and agency. Those are the real key questions. And of course, for some of these groups, the urgency and the agency is there, but it's not in the priority. And so that puts you into the kind of concerned and cautious group. The cautious group kind of think this is happening, but let's not go too quickly. And it's probably not going to happen anytime soon. So we just got to, so for them, urgency, when you say to them things like, we've got 2 election cycles after this election in terms of the timeline to really turn this around, to do something about it, and for a lot of people, that just seems like it's very hard for them to get their head around. So, so that's kind of how we determine where people sit in the segments. And it's been a very useful way to really understand what it takes to get people to really think about it. And often in the communications with the organisations that are talking about climate change, it's really important to meet people where they are, and find a way to kind of talk to them. If somebody's concerned or cautious, talking to them like they're alarmed can often make them turn off. So that's why it's been, particularly useful to a lot of organisations to really understand, what are the drivers and the barriers of people's attitudes and behaviours around this.
And what about the question about how you place yourself as a climate activist?
How I place myself as yeah, I mean, I'm an interesting climate activist, and then I would say I'm an advocate. I don't know if I'm an activist. I don't. I go to my fair share of protests and I speak out about climate a lot, and I love working with organisations that are real activists. So I've spent a lot of time working for groups like Parents for Climate Action and Bushfire Survivors for Climate Action. I work with a lot of sporting organisations that want to talk about climate. I suppose for me, I place myself, really very firmly in the alarmed group. But some people who are in the alarmed group can often feel very angry and frustrated. I have my moments of anger and frustration, but I'm lucky enough to feel a very kind of useful member, in that I'm spending a lot of time giving these activist organisations the right research so they can really hone their communication, really understand how they can get people involved. And I spend quite a lot of time talking to the media about it. I think one thing that can often be a very convenient analysis is that people go, oh, well, no, people don't care about climate change anymore because of cost of living. And for me, it's really important to be able to say, well, look, that's not entirely true, and to talk about the extent to which, it is still important to people. It's important to people in slightly different ways because things have changed. And yeah, so I get the chance to be able to do that. And so to the extent to which that's activism, it's more than it is. It's one of the ways I feel useful and feel a little bit less worried about what might happen, given we do get presented a lot of information about what's happening by climate scientists about what's actually happening in the world, which can sometimes be a bit demoralising.
So you may call yourself like a cautious alarmist. So it's not so pushed so at the extreme, because like you also touched on this, that there could be a fine balance when you get close to alarmism and then you go beyond. I've come across also this group who are called the doomers, who say, it's too late.
It's exactly. I'm definitely not a doomer. And I think that that's probably a little bit to do with my personality, that I'm generally optimistic and I just like to get, be helpful and get things done. I also think it's not a very ethical position, I'm a mother of 3 young children, to be a doomer, which is like, oh, it's all, we're all, we're all screwed. I don't think I can hold that position and also be a parent. That doesn't feel like a very compatible with being a parent, because, I wouldn't have brought them into the world unless I thought there was a chance that it was a good world. But I work very hard every day to make sure it is as much as possible. I would describe myself as alarmed, active, and mostly optimistic. And in fact, the more that I work in the movement, potentially sometimes the more optimistic I am, because I do see really good things happening. I see lots of bad, obviously worrying things happening, but I see lots of good things happening as well, particularly in Australia. And so, that we always say that action brings optimism. There's a kind of notion of active hope, which is that hope isn't just sitting back thinking somebody's going to save us or it's all be fine or whatever. You create hope and opportunity by actually doing things and being active and working with other like-minded people. So that's, I think, what I try and do.
That's very important, I think, to keep that balance, because I find that sometimes if you're too alarmed, then you get into this stage of triggering the fight or flight mode.
Oh, absolutely.
And so it's also difficult to talk with people from the other categories. And to this topic, my next question would be, we touched briefly on this, but having this, distinguished about amongst these categories, how do you actually address, how do you shape a message for each of these categories? And before that, actually, you need to know who the categories are. I mean, when you talk with someone, how do you identify them, and how you talk across categories? I mean, it's quite complicated, but let's say, also in the frame of just to give you some other pointers that I know you're very, very familiar with, how the tobacco industry addressed the issues of tobacco or the ozone hole we discussed before. But climate change seems to be such a distant issue that, it's very different from all the others we've seen before. So how do you shape this storytelling?
So it's actually quite relatively easy. There's about 7 questions that you can respond that kind of put you into these different categories. And so you get a bit of a sense of where somebody sits. We know that certain language and we know certain frames, and I suppose we would say messages, work better with some groups than others. And so, for example, people who might be a bit cautious about climate change, the economic opportunities of renewable energy might be a better way to talk to people, or like, you're going to save money on your electricity bills if you had solar and the government's going to give you that. That can often be more effective. And they don't necessarily want to hear that from, climate activists or whatever. They often want to hear it from, maybe they want to hear it from a tradie, or maybe they want to hear it from somebody like a neighbour. So who they trust or who they want to hear this information from, how much of the urgency, or I suppose, or the kind of the reason, the drivers for acting can often change. The benefits for acting can often change. So it can be really quite different. And for some people, so for example, the alarmed, they're often less focused on the economic benefits of this and much more focused on other questions like the environmental benefits or the health benefits of less pollution in the air. For other people, it might be it's good for jobs or cheaper electricity. So often we're giving a sense of what the people's values and what they value is the way to approach it. Increasingly, who they listen to and who they trust. So the further you get on the kind of cautious and doubtful group, the much more likely they're going to be conservative in. And so maybe so often they don't necessarily want to hear from, they want to hear from like-minded people. So they might want to hear from farmers about how having renewable energy on their farms is really kind of useful for them, and it's another source of income. or, they kind of want to hear from less likely to from progressive politicians than conservative politicians. So who we're listening to is often as important as what the message is and what is driving us to believe that we can be involved in it or believe it or be involved in the impact as well. So, and there's been lots of examples of when this has worked and, people using it in many different kinds of ways. But I mean, what it all boils down to is that climate change affects everybody. In order for us to find a way to talk to everybody about it, we need a million different voices telling different stories that really resonate and connect with people, rather than just the kind of 30% of Australians who are already really worried, really doing things. They're already doing stuff. They're already on board. It's the people who are like, what does this matter to me, and how relevant it is, that we've got to find new and different ways to reach those people, talk to those people, understand what those people's views and what they want to get out of it all.
We'll soon get to this issue of what more we can do, what actual actions we can do. But before we get there, I also want to touch briefly on just broadening this issue of why people perceive things in different ways. And you mentioned at the beginning also you came from climate change being on number 4, number 5, or whatever. So in this situation, when in people. In countries like US, again, we've seen with recent times, like I mentioned before, the actual urgency is very far from climate change. Is get to the end of the month, and the money,
exactly.
The money doesn't last.
Get to payday. Absolutely.
Why should you worry about climate change? And you get, if you look at Europe, for example, there is a very nice example of how things could have worked or are working in some way with the Green Deal. But there's been a big backlash because of all these issues, economic issues and so on. And people now are, throwing stones on the Green Deal because they think this is all, the automotive industry in Germany has fallen because of the Green Deal and all these things, when actually, China, on the other hand, is growing a lot on, betting on this green technologies and all the rest. Yeah. But ultimately, we have this, the different views, different drives and so on. But ultimately what needs to happen is something that is common to everybody in the world, because climate action, climate change, if we want to do something about the reduction in temperature, is to do with the emissions, as the science says. And the emissions has to happen globally, because it doesn't really matter if Australia changes the emissions here and everybody else doesn't, because we know that. So how do you actually, I know it's a big question, but how do you actually frame it in a way that this is a common problem, and what can be done to make our own contribution to the big picture?
So we spend a lot of time trying to do that, because it is a bit of a challenge, and Australians do tend to think like we're a small country, we're not making, the biggest impact. That being said, in all the surveys where we've asked the question, I often ask people, to what extent do you agree or disagree with this statement? Australia should play a part in the global effort to combat climate change. Most people agree with that statement. If you explain to people it's not so much the energy that we produce in Australia, but also the energy we export in terms of being a net exporter of things like coal and gas, they also understand how critical it is for us to move away from coal and gas for the rest of the country. It also makes people realise that as some of those countries might be using less of those resources, the more that we need to do more. I also think that one of the things Australians can get their head around is that even though we're a small country in terms of population, we've got enormous opportunity in terms of land mass. So we could be a much bigger part of the solution than we are of the problem, because we can actually if we start to use all this sun and wind that we have, we can actually be an exporter of renewable energy. We also own half the lithium deposits in the world, and we've got a whole lot of rare earths. So we're really well positioned as well. So I think part of that is a way for us to talk about how we can kind of punch above our weight, or whatever you call it, in relation to the solution, and to recognise that while some countries might go back and forth on their attitudes to climate, like we've seen in the United States, the overall movement is in a particular direction. It just has to be. And so I think that seeing the opportunity that we have is an important part of that as well. So, you know, there are ways around it. And as well as kind of, we think about, you know, the role that Australia played in the very, very early development of the solar cell as well. Why wouldn't we want to keep doing that? Like, investing in our ability to solve some of these problems. While we might not be the ones who are the big polluters, we can be the big inventors of the solution to that. And I think that leaning into that can often be very effective for people when you start to say the kinds of things that, you know, Australians have invented before, like things like Wi-Fi and the Hills hoist, and, you know, like I said, the very early important work that was done in Australia on the solar cell makes people think like, yeah, you know, we can be part of this. And I think that in a sense, you've kind of lean into a bit of Aussie pride and patriotism can be helpful when people, in the face of people thinking like, we're a small country, we're not the problem, and, you know, we're a small player.
I fully agree. And just as a quick side note, we actually, with some colleagues, we wrote a paper which is called Rebalancing Regional and Remote Australia, which goes along the lines you said about exploiting natural resources. And other people are doing the same here in Australia as well. So hopefully that will take off. So just to get towards the end, we'd like to get into some practical actions. So what can we suggest to people in terms of actions to trying to contribute to this climate change issue? And it can go from, let's say, how you one-liner. I don't know if you have a one-liner to talk with someone who is on the other side of the spectrum, to actions, real actions that we can do every day, which could be electric vehicles, but also considering that not everybody can afford them. So, you know, it's
Yeah, do you know what? One of the things that we find in all of our work is that there is a really significant gap between how people feel about climate change, and particularly the solutions around part of the solutions to climate change, like renewable energy, and what they think other people think. So, for example, the CSIRO years ago did a very, very important piece of work where it asked people not so much what they thought about climate change. They asked people what percentage of Australians are climate deniers or don't think climate change is a thing. And often people would massively overestimate how many people reject the climate science. They kind of say, oh, it's 20 or 30% of the population rather than 10. In our work, we'll say to people, you know, what do you think about offshore wind? You know, do you think it's a good idea? And you know, there'll be a reasonably high percentage of people who look as a good idea. But if you say to them, do you think people around you, your community, are as supportive of offshore wind as you are? It'll be much lower. And I think, what do people base that on? They base that on the fact that there's a lot of noise in the media, and they imagine the noise represents a larger percentage of the antagonism or lack of support than there really is. So one of the most effective things you can actually do is talk about this issue, and talk about that you think things are a good idea, or, you know, you're open to it, because that kind of develops, it's what we call breaking the climate silence, which is if nobody talks about it, everybody assumes people aren't thinking about it, or they're not supportive, or the loud voices of opposition are in fact represent a larger part of the community than they do. So one of the things I try and do And, it's important not to be kind of shouty about it, kind of have just these very gentle conversations with people about it, where you're not shoving it down somebody's throat, but also asking them what they think as well. I do have an electric vehicle, and I often quite like whenever I have to stop and charge it, I'll wander around a bit, and people might ask me about the car. They go, "Oh, what's it like?" And I have a bit of a chat to them about it, and what I like about it, and what are some of the things I've had to get used to. So I actually think in so many ways this is what's useful. So many ways just talking about it. I also think going out and educating yourself, not just about the fundamentals of the climate science, so you can have a bit of a conversation with people about it, but the amazing things that are happening to solve some of the problems, and educating yourself about what's possible, I think is really effective as well. And then if you've got the stomach for it, talking to people, seeing if the organisations that you're part of, the community organisations or your workplace or your church, are prepared to also talk about it. I mean, we're just seeing now in the last couple of days so the accolades and the love for the late Pope. He wrote a really powerful encyclical on climate and the environment, and the need to protect need to protect the environment, and need to address climate change. And within the context of normalising that conversation within faith circles, really effective. Educate yourself about the diversity of people who are really focused and interested on climate change as well. And you might find some new arguments and some new ways to raise these conversations in the networks and the organisations that you're already part of.
And I find actually that also the terminology sometimes matters. Like I tend to avoid terms like deniers or skeptical. I mean, skeptical is the worst, because science is about skepticism. So
yes, of course.
Why shouldn't we be? But deniers also, I feel like it's one of those words that create barriers.
Absolutely.
If you say to someone you're a denier, you just close the conversation. That's it.
It's true.
So we need to be, I guess, careful about also how we use this terminology. Be open to discussing things, because even within the scientific community, sometimes it's hard because there are very strong views about where people think they stand and so on. And so having this more mellow words, I would say, could help.
Agreed. And I think just look, if somebody is really a belligerent, dyed-in-the-wool, aggressive, anti-climate science person, I'm not sure all the most, the most kind of, effective, most effective kind of conversation with them is going to change their mind. And I would suggest kind of perhaps not, but I think that that's still a minority. There's plenty of other people who haven't thought about it much or thought about it a bit. They've never talked to people about it. And often I say is that if you actually do have a conversation with somebody about it, it might be the only time they've talked about it with a stranger or somebody they know. Like just keeping that conversation open and hearing from them, and what are they thinking and where do they get the information? And, in a very non-judgmental, open way is in itself a real, really important.
I'd just like to close with a very, very difficult question for you, because I think you can be one that can address it with your knowledge, because normally we do the scenarios from a scientific point of view. We say there's going to be so much gas, so much, and this is how the climate is going to change. But I haven't come across, maybe I've missed it, but I haven't come across some kind of projection, some kind of prediction, let's say, of where we are in the trajectory on the change, on the actual change, on the social
and the change of attitudes of social
because
change.
because we've been talking about climate change for 30, 40 years, and yes, there are changes in uptake of renewables and so on, but there is still a long way to go. So where do you think we are placed now, and how long is going to take to get to like 100%, if not 100%, 80, whatever?
Well, if you look at anyone under the age of 30, so there's big generational change happening. So at the moment, only 1% of people under 30 would be described as dismissive on climate change, and over half, so actually close to 60% of people under 30 are alarmed about climate change. They're so alarmed that in the work that I do outside climate change, I've had young people tell me that they don't want to have children, or maybe only want to have one child, because of not just economic challenges but climate. So a demographic wave is changing, but of course it's going to be a long time before that's the majority of the population. What we find is increasingly more and more people are becoming alarmed or concerned, but because there is a general polarisation across society around a whole lot of political issues generally, we're not necessarily finding that some of those other segments are getting bigger. What we're finding is some more people are just like so overwhelmed about what's happening in the world that they want to care about climate, but it just seems too much. So they're kind of turning away and disengaging. That's a challenge. And I think increasingly we might see some people who are a bit fatalistic about it all, thinking, okay, there's nothing we can do. This is how it's going. So it's going to be survival of the fittest. I can imagine in, I would say, 20 years' time, if I'm going to be optimistic about the trajectory, at least in Australia, we'll be so close to almost all of our energy sources being from renewable sources, that will be in many ways uncontroversial. People won't be like, we've got to hold on to coal and gas. And in fact, we have got surveys where we ask people, in 20 years' time, what do you think our energy mix should be? And coal and gas is like 1 or 2%, and the rest is renewable energy in 20 years' time. So I think we'll have gone through, to the extent to which you can predict the future, we've gone through so much of that energy transition because we're just galloping through it now, that it'll be like day-to-day life. What we will be inevitably managing is extreme weather and the impact of extreme weather, and quite a lot of like how we as a society manage that. How do we insure ourselves? How do governments tax people based on how to protect people from those extreme weather events? So, whether people believe the science or not, their lived experience in 20 years' time will be living with renewable energy and living with the impacts of climate change. And that's where we'll be.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for this very insightful conversation. I learned a lot from you, and I hope also that our listeners will enjoy this episode. Thank you. Thank you very much again, Rebecca.
Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to explore our other interviews and subscribe to our channel to receive notifications about future episodes.